This audio is recorded by John Lothe. It's intended for educational purposes. If you find value in these works, and if you'd like to assist me in the production of these recordings, head over to my website where you can donate as little as $1 to help me continue making these. I really appreciate all your help. Thanks for having a look and a listen. Your friend, John Lothe. Tragedy and Hope: A History of the World in Our Time by Carroll Quigley. Chapter 12. The Japanese Assault, 1931 to 1941. With one notable exception, the Japanese background for aggression presented a strong parallel to that of Germany. The exception was the industrial strength of the two powers. Japan was really a have-not nation, lacking most of the natural resources to sustain a great industrial system. It lacked much of the necessary basic materials such as coal, iron, petroleum, alloy minerals, water power, or even food. In comparison, Germany's claim to be a have-not nation was merely a propaganda device. Other than this, the similarity of the two countries was striking. Each had a completely cartelized industry, a militaristic tradition, a hard-working population which respected authority and loved order, a national obsession with its own unique value, and a resentment at the rest of the world for failure to recognize this, and a constitutional structure in which a facade of parliamentary constitutionalism barely concealed the reality of power wielded by an alliance of army, landlords, and industry. The fact that the Japanese Constitution of 1889 was copied from the Constitution of Bismarck goes far to explain this last similarity. We have already mentioned the acute problem presented to Japan by the contrast between their limited natural resources and their growing problems. While their resources did not increase, their population grew from 31 million in 1873 to 73 million in 1939. The rate of growth reaching its peak in the period 1925 to 1930, an 8% increase in these 5 years. With great ingenuity and tireless energy, the Japanese people tried to make ends meet. With foreign exchange earned from merchant shipping or from exports of silk, wood products, or seafoods, raw materials were imported, manufactured into industrial products, and exported to obtain the foreign exchange necessary to pay for imports of raw materials or food. By keeping costs and prices low, the Japanese were able to undersell European exporters of cotton textiles and iron products in the markets of Asia, especially in China and Indonesia. The possibility of relieving their population pressure by emigration, as Europe had done earlier, was prevented by the fact that the obvious colonial areas had already been taken in hand by Europeans. English-speaking persons who held the best and yet unfilled areas slammed the door on Japanese immigration in the period after 1901, justifying their actions on racial and economic arguments. American restrictions on Japanese immigration, originated among laboring groups in California, were a very bitter pill for Japan and injured its pride greatly. The steady rise in tariffs against Japanese manufactured goods after 1897, a development which was also led by America, served to increase the difficulties of Japan's position. So also did the slow exhaustion of the Pacific fisheries, the growing, if necessary, restrictions on such fishing by conservationist agreements, the decrease in forestry resources, and political and social unrest in Asia. For a long time, Japan was protected from the full impact of this problem by a series of favorable accidents. The First World War was a splendid windfall. It ended European commercial competition in Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. It increased the demand for Japanese goods and services, and it made Japan an international creditor for the first time. Capital investment in the 5 years 1915 to 1920 was 8 times as much as in the 10 years 1905 to 1915.
Laborers employed in factories using over 5 workers each increased from 948,000 in 1914 to 1,612,000 in 1919. Ocean shipping rose from 1.5 million tons in 1914 to 3 million tons in 1918, while income from shipping freight rose from 40 million yen in 1914 to 450 million in 1918. The favorable balance of international trade amounted to 1,480 million yen for the 4 years 1915 to 1918. Social life, the economic structure, and the price system, already dislocated by this rapid change, received a terrible jolt in the Depression of 1920 to 1921. But Japan rapidly recovered and was shielded from the full consequences of her large population and limited resources by the boom of the 1920s. Rapid technological advance in the United States, Germany, and Japan itself, demand for Japanese goods, especially textiles, in southern and southeastern Asia, American loans throughout the world, large American purchases of Japanese silk, and the general boom psychology of the whole world protected Japan from the full impact of its situation until 1929 to 1931. Under this protection, the older authoritarian and militaristic traditions were weakened. Liberalism and democracy grew slowly, but steadily. The aping of Germanic traditions in intellectual and political life, which had been going on since 1880, was largely abandoned. The first-party government was established in 1918. Universal manhood suffrage was established in 1925. Civilian governors replaced military rule for the first time in colonial areas, like Formosa. The army was reduced from 21 to 17 divisions in 1924. The Navy was reduced by international agreement in 1922 and in 1930. And there was a great expansion of education, especially in the higher levels. This movement toward democracy and liberalism alarmed the militarists and drove them to desperation. At the same time, the growth of unity and public order in China, which these militarists had regarded as a potential victim for their operations, convinced them that they must act quickly before it was too late. The World Depression gave this group their great opportunity. Even before its onset, however, 4 ominous factors in Japanese political life hung like threatening clouds on the horizon. These were A. The lack of any constitutional requirement for a government responsible to the Diet. B. The continued constitutional freedom of the army from civilian control. C. The growing use of political assassination by the conservatives as a means for removing liberal politicians from public life, as was done against 3 premiers and many lesser persons in the period 1918 to 1932. And D. The growing appeal of revolutionary socialism in laboring circles. The World Depression and the financial crisis hit Japan a terrible blow. The declining demand for raw silk in competition with synthetic fibers, like rayon, and the slow decline of such Asiatic markets as China and India, because of political disturbances and growing industrialization, made this blow harder to bear. Under this impact, the reactionary and aggressive forces in Japanese society were able to solidify their control of the state, intimidate all domestic opposition, and embark on that adventure of aggression and destruction that led ultimately to the disasters of 1945. These economic storms were severe, but Japan took the road to aggression because of its own past traditions rather than for economic reasons. The militarist traditions of feudal Japan continued into the modern period and flourished in spite of steady criticism and opposition. The constitutional structure shielded both the military leaders and the civilian politicians from popular control, and justified their actions as being in the emperor's name. But these 2 branches of government were separated so that the civilians had no control over the generals. The law and custom of the Constitution allowed the generals and admirals to approach the emperor directly, without the knowledge or consent of the cabinet, and required that only officers of this rank could serve as ministers for these services in the cabinet itself. No civilian intervened in the chain of command from emperor to lowly private, and the armed services became a state within the state. Since the officers did not hesitate to use their positions to ensure civilian compliance with their wishes, and constantly resorted to armed force and assassination, the power of the military grew steadily after 1927. All their acts, they said, were in the name of the emperor, for the glory of Japan, to free the nation from corruption, from partisan politicians, and from plutocratic exploitation, and to restore the old Japanese virtues of order, self-sacrifice, and devotion to authority. Separate from the armed forces, sometimes in opposition to them, but generally dependent upon them as the chief purchasers of the products of heavy industry, were the forces of monopoly capitalism. These were led, as we have indicated, by the 8 great economic complexes, controlled as family units, known as zaibatsu. These 8 controlled 75% of the nation's corporate wealth by 1930, and were headed by Mitsuyu, which had 15% of all corporate capital in the country. They engaged in openly corrupt relationships with Japanese politicians, and, less frequently, with Japanese militarists. They usually cooperated with each other. For example, in 1927, the efforts of Mitsuyu and Mitsubishi to smash a smaller competitor, Suzuki Company of Kobe, precipitated a financial panic which closed most of the banks in Japan. While the Showa Bank, operated jointly by the Zaibatsu, took over many smaller corporations and banks which failed in the crisis, and over 180,000 depositors lost their savings. The cabinet of the militarist general Tanaka granted 1,500 million yen to save the Zaibatsu themselves from the consequences of their greed. The militaristic and nationalistic traditions were widely accepted by the Japanese people. These traditions, extolled by the majority of politicians and teachers, and propagated by numerous patriotic societies, both open and secret, were given a free hand, while any opposing voices were crushed out by legal or illegal methods, until, by 1930, most such voices were silenced. About the same date, the militarists and the Zaibatsu, who had previously been in opposition, as often as in coalition, came together in their last fateful alliance. They united on a program of heavy industrialization, militarization, and foreign aggression. Eastern Asia, especially northern China and Manchuria, became the designated victim, since these seemed to offer the necessary raw materials and markets for the industrialists, and the field of glory and bounty for the militarists. In aiming their attack at Manchuria in 1931 and at northern China in 1937, the Japanese chose a victim who was clearly vulnerable. As we have seen, the Chinese Revolution of 1912 had done little to rejuvenate the country. Partisan bickering, disagreements on goals, struggles for selfish advantages, and the constant threat to good government from military leaders who were not much more than bandits disrupted the country and made rehabilitation very difficult. North of the Yangtze River, the warlords fought for supremacy until 1926, while south of the river, at Canton, the Kuomintang, a political party founded by Sun Yat-sen and oriented toward the west, set up its own government. Unlike the northern warlords, this party had ideals and a program, although it must be confessed that both of these were embodied in words rather than in deeds. The Kuomintang ideals were a mixture of Western, native Chinese, and Bolshevik Russian factors. They sought to achieve a unified, independent China with a democratic government and a mixed, cooperative, socialistic, individualistic economic system. In general, Dr. Sun went to China's own traditions for his cultural ideas, to Western, largely Anglo-American traditions for his political ideas, and to a mixture with strong socialist elements for his economic ideas. His program envisaged the achievement of these ideals through 3 successive stages of development, of which the first would be a period of military domination to secure unity and independence. The second would be a period of Kuomintang dictatorship to secure the necessary political education of the masses. And only the third would be one of constitutional democracy. This program was followed as far as Stage 2. This presumably was reached in 1927 with the announcement that the Kuomintang would henceforth be the sole legal political party. This had been preceded by 11 years of military domination, in which Chiang Kai-shek emerged as the military ruler of most of China in the name of the Kuomintang. The Kuomintang, under Dr. Sun's influence, accepted the support and some of the ideas of the Communist International, especially in the period 1924 to 1927. Lenin's theories of the nature of capitalist imperialism were quite persuasive to the Chinese and gave them, they thought, the intellectual justification for resisting foreign intervention in Chinese affairs. Russian agents, led by Mikhail Borodin, came to China after 1923 to assist China in economic reconstruction, political education, and resistance to imperialism. These Russians reorganized the Kuomintang as a totalitarian political party on the Soviet Communist model, and reorganized Chinese military training at the famous Whampoa Military Academy. From these circles emerged Chiang Kai-shek, with German military advisors playing a prominent role in his activities. He launched a series of attacks which extended Kuomintang rule into the territory of the warlords north of the Yangtze River. The chief of these northern warlords, Chiang Xiulin, held his position by cooperation with the Japanese and by resistance to Russian efforts to penetrate Manchuria. As Chiang Kai-shek achieved military success in these areas after 1926, he became increasingly conservative, and Dr. Sun's program of democracy and socialism receded further into the future. At the same time, the interference and intrigue of the communist elements in the Kuomintang camp justified increasingly vigorous repression of their activities. Finally, Chiang's increasing conservatism culminated in 1927 in his marriage to a member of the wealthy Song family. Of this family, Song Su-vin was an important banker and speculator. His brother-in-law, Hong So-shi, was in a similar economic position, while another sister, alienated from the family by her communist sympathies, was Mrs. Sun Yat-sen. Song and Kong, between them, dominated the Kuomintang government, the former becoming Minister of Finance, while the latter was Minister of Industry, Commerce, and Labor. In 1927, the communist collaboration was ended by the Kuomintang. The Russians were expelled from China, and the Kuomintang became the only legal party. The native Chinese communists, under Moscow-trained leaders like Mao Zedong, concentrated their strength in the southern rural areas, where they established themselves by agrarian reforms, expropriating landlords, reducing rents, taxes, and interest rates, and building a communist rural militia manned by the peasants. As soon as the nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek completed the conquest of northern China with the capture of Peking in June 1928, they shifted their attack southward in an effort to destroy the communist center in Jiangxi. The Communist Army, whose growing exactions had disillusioned its peasant supporters, retreated in an orderly withdrawal on a twisting 6,000-mile route to northwestern China in 1934 to 1935. Even after the Japanese attack on Manchuria in 1931, Chiang continued to fight the communists, directing 5 large-scale attacks upon them in the period 1930 to 1933. Although the communists declared war on Japan in 1932 and continued to demand a united front of all Chinese against this aggressor for the whole period 1931 to 1937. Though the Japanese seizure of Manchuria in the autumn of 1931 was an independent action of the Japanese military forces, it had to be condoned by the civilian leaders. The Chinese retaliated by a boycott of Japanese goods, which seriously reduced Japan's exports. To force an end to this boycott, Japan landed forces at Shanghai, 1932, and, after severe fighting, in which much Japanese abuse was inflicted upon Europeans, the Chinese forces were driven from the city and compelled to agree to a termination of the economic boycott against Japan. About the same time, Manchuria was set up as a Japanese protectorate under the rule of Henry Pui, who had abdicated the Chinese throne in 1912. As early as January 1932, the United States notified all signers of the Nine-Power Treaty of 1922 that it would refuse to accept territorial changes made by force in violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact to outlaw war. An appeal to the League of Nations for support made by China on September 21, 1931, the same day that England went off the gold standard, passed through an interminable series of procedural disputes and finally led to a commission of inquiry under the Earl of Lytton. The report of this commission, released in October 1932, sharply condemned the actions of Japan, but recommended no effective joint action to oppose these. The League accepted the Stimson Doctrine of non-recognition and expressed sympathy for the Chinese position. This whole affair had been rehashed endlessly since 1931, to the accompaniment of claims and counterclaims that effective League action was blocked by the absence of the United States from its councils, or by Stimson's delay in condemning Japanese aggression, or by British refusal to support Stimson's suggestions for action against Japan. All these discussions neglect the vital point that the Japanese army in Manchuria was not under the control of the Japanese civil government, with which negotiations were being conducted, and that these civil authorities, who opposed the Manchurian attack, could not give effective voice to this opposition without risking assassination. Premier Yuko Hamaguchi had been killed as recently as November 1930 for approving the London Naval Agreement, to which the militarists objected, and Premier Ki Inukai was dealt with in the same way in May 1932. Throughout, the League discussions were not conducted with the right party. Except for its violation of nationalist feelings and the completely objectionable means by which it was achieved, the acquisition of Manchuria by Japan possessed many strategic and economic advantages. It gave Japan industrial resources which it vitally needed, and could, in time, have strengthened the Japanese economy. Separation of the area from China, which had not controlled it effectively for many years, would have restricted the sphere of Chiang's government to a more manageable territory. Above all, it could have served as a counterpoise to Soviet power in the Far East and provided a fulcrum to restrain Soviet actions in Europe after the collapse of Germany. Unfortunately, the uncompromising avarice and ignorance of the Japanese militarists made any such solution impossible. This was made quite certain by their two major errors, the attack on China in 1937 and the attack on the United States in 1941. In both cases, the militarists bit off more than they could chew, and destroyed any possible advantages they might have gained from the acquisition of Manchuria in 1931. In the 7 years after the first attack on Manchuria in September 1931, Japan sank 2.5 billion yen in capital investments in that area, mostly in mining, iron production, electric power, and petroleum. Year after year, this investment increased without returning any immediate yield to Japan, since output from this new investment was immediately reinvested. The only items of much help for Japan itself were iron ore, pig iron, and certain chemical fertilizers. The Manchurian soybean crop, although it declined under Japanese rule, was exchanged with Germany for needed commodities obtainable there. For Japan's other urgent material needs, such as raw cotton, rubber, and petroleum, no help could be found in Manchuria. In spite of costly capital investment, it could produce no more than its own needs in petroleum, chiefly from liquefaction of coal. The failure of Manchuria to provide an answer to Japan's economic problems led the Japanese military leaders toward a new act of aggression, this time directed toward North China itself. As they were preparing their new assault, Chiang Kai-shek was busy preparing a sixth campaign against the communists, still lurking in the remote northwestern part of China. Neither the growing threat from Japan nor the appeals from the Chinese communists to form a united Chinese front against Nippon deterred Chiang from his purpose to crush the communists until, in December 1936, he was suddenly kidnapped by his own northern commander, Xiang Su-ling, at Xi'an, and was forced, under threat of death, to promise to fight Japan. A Kuomintang Communist United Front was formed, in which Chiang promised to fight Japan rather than the communists and to relax the Kuomintang restrictions on civil liberties, while the communists promised to abolish their Chinese Soviet government, become a regional government of the Republic of China, end the expropriation of the landlords, cease their attacks on the Kuomintang, and incorporate their armed forces into the National Army of Chiang Kai-shek on a regional basis. This agreement had hardly been made and had not yet been published on North China, July 1937. They were generally successful against a tenacious defense by the national government, driving it successfully from Nanking to Hankow, November 1937, and from Hankow to Chongqing, on the remote upper reaches of the Yangtze River, October 1938. The Japanese, with quite inadequate forces of only 17 divisions, totaling less than 250,000 men in all areas, tried to destroy the nationalists and communist armies in China, to cut China off from all foreign supplies by controlling all railroads, ports, and rivers, and to maintain order in Manchuria and occupied China. This was an impossible task. The occupied areas soon took the form of an open lattice in which Japanese troops patrolled the rivers and railroads, but the country between was largely in the control of communist guerrillas. The retreat of the nationalist government to remote Chongqing, and its inability to retain the allegiance of the Chinese peasants, especially those behind the Japanese lines, because of its close alliance with the oligarchy of landlords, merchants, and bankers, steadily weakened the Kuomintang and strengthened the communists. The rivalry between the Chinese communists and the Kuomintang broke out intermittently in 1938 to 1941, but Japan was unable to profit from it in any decisive way because of its economic weakness. The great investment in Manchuria and the adoption of a policy of wholehearted aggression required a reorganization of Japan's own economy from its previous emphasis on light industry for the export market to a new emphasis on heavy industry for armaments and heavy investment. This was carried out so ruthlessly that Japan's production of heavy industry rose from 3 billion yen in 1933 to 8.2 billion yen in 1938, while textile production rose from 2.9 billion yen to no more than 3.7 billion yen in the same 5 years. By 1938, the products of heavy industry accounted for 53% of Japan's industrial output. This increased Japan's need for imports, while reducing her ability to provide the exports, previously textiles, to pay for such imports. By 1937, Japan's unfavorable balance of trade with the non-yen area amounted to 925 million yen, or almost 4 times the average of the years before 1937. Income from shipping was reduced by military demands as well, with the result that Japan's unfavorable balance of trade was reflected in a heavy outflow of gold. 1,685 million yen in 1937 to 1938. By the end of 1938, it was clear that Japan was losing its financial and commercial ability to buy necessary materials of foreign origin. The steps taken by the United States, Australia, and others to restrict export of strategic or military materials to Japan made this problem even more acute. The attack on China had been intended to remedy this situation by removing the Chinese boycott on Japanese goods, by bringing a supply of necessary materials, especially raw cotton, under Japan's direct control, and by creating an extension of the yen area, where the use of foreign exchange would not be needed for trading purposes. On the whole, these purposes were not achieved. Guerrilla activities and Japanese inability to control the rural areas made the achievement of a yen area impossible, made trade difficult, and reduced the production of cotton drastically, by about 1/3. Export of iron ore from China to Japan fell from 2.3 million tons in 1937 to 0.3 million in 1938, although coal exports rose slightly. In an effort to increase production, Japan began to pour capital investments into the still unpacified areas of North China at a rate which rivaled the rate of investment in Manchuria. The 4-year plan of 1938 called for 1,420 million yen of such investment by 1942. This project added to the need for Japan to feed and clothe the inhabitants of North China, made that area a drain on the whole Japanese economy, so that Japanese exports to that area rose from 179 billion yen in 1937 to 312 million in 1938. To make matters worse, the people of this occupied territory refused to accept or use the newly established yen currency because of guerrilla threats to shoot anyone found in possession of it. All this had an adverse effect on Japan's financial position. In 2 years of the China War, 1936 through 1937 to 1938 through 1939, the Japanese budget rose from 2.3 to 8.4 billion yen, of which 80% went for military purposes. Government debt and commodity prices rose steadily, but the Japanese people responded so readily to taxation, government loans, and demands for increased production that the system continued to function. By the end of 1939, however, it was clear that the threefold burden of a conversion to heavy industry, which ruined the export trade, a heavy rate of investment in Manchuria and North China, and an indecisive war with nationalist China, could not be borne forever, especially under the pressure of the growing reluctance of neutral countries to supply Japan with necessary strategic goods. The two most vital needs were in petroleum products and rubber. To the militarists who controlled Japan, both politically and economically after 1939, it seemed that the occupation of the Dutch Indies and Malaya could do much to alleviate these shortages. The occupation of the Netherlands itself by Hitler's hordes in 1940 and the involvement of England in the European War since 1939 seemed to offer a golden opportunity for Japan to seize these southern regions. To do so would require long lines of communication from Japan to Indonesia. These lines would be exposed to attack from the American bases in the Philippines or from the British base in Singapore. Judging the American psychology as similar to their own, the Japanese militarists were sure that in such circumstances, America would not hesitate to attack these vulnerable lines of communication. Thus, it seemed to them that a Japanese attack on the Dutch Indies would inevitably lead to an American war on Japan. Facing this problem, the Japanese militarists reached what seemed to their minds to be an inescapable decision. They decided to attack the United States first. From this decision came the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941.